Towards the conclusion of the 19th century, Cuba was one of the few remaining Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Because of this, revolutionary sentiments were beginning to arise and would reach their apex in 1895, just before the start of the Spanish-American War. In response to the growing independence movement, the Spanish government elected General Valeriano Weyler as governor of Cuba and tasked him to deal with Cuban insurrections. In order to separate Cuban citizens from revolutionaries, Weyler relocated 300,000 Cuban citizens into reconcentration camps. These camps would claim thousands of Cuban lives as they were infested with disease, poor sanitary conditions, and starvation. Valeriano's policies would prove ineffective, as 3 years later the United States would declare war on Spain and assist Cuba in its fight for independence, after they claimed that Spain was responsible for the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The U.S. was mainly motivated to assist Cuba because of economic and political interests. Before the war, the U.S. was interested in Cuba's natural resources such as sugar and its availability as a location for a military base. They felt that they could exploit the Cuban independence movement as a way to further their influence in the Western Hemisphere. Revolutionaries sought complete independence from Spain and were highly influenced by the works of José Martí, a Cuban writer and poet who would go on to greatly influence the Cuban people throughout the 20th century and even today. Martí grew up in Havana Harbor and witnessed the devastation of the 10 Years' War. The war influenced many of Martí's early works, such as one of his most famous sonnets, 10 de octubre. No es sueño, es verdad, grito de guerra. Lanza al cubano pueblo enfurecido, el pueblo que 3 siglos ha sufrido. Cuanto de negro la opresión encierra, del ancho cuarto a escambría cierra. Ruge el cañón y al pelco estampido, el bárbaro opreso estremecido. Gime, solloza y tímido se altera. De su fuerza y heroica valentía, tumbas los campos son y su grandeza degrada y mancha horrible cobardía. Gracias a Dios que al fin con entereza rompe Cuba el dogal que la oprime y altiva y libre yergue su cabeza. The poem tells Cuban citizens to wake up and realize that it is their God-given right to declare their independence. Martí believed in individual independence, as he calls upon Cuban slaves to declare themselves independent as well. After being exiled from Cuba on the count of treason, Martí traveled all over the world and continued to fight for Cuban independence through his writings. His work even inspired the Castro dictatorship and would continue to influence Cubans for years to come. Cuba was one of the most important theaters of the war. The Spanish were severely outnumbered and outgunned by both American and Cuban troops. Even Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders intervened in the fighting on the island. After months of fighting, the Cubans would eventually declare their independence at the climax of the Spanish-American War with the help of the United States. The war also liberated remaining Spanish colonies such as Guam and the Philippines. However, Cuba would end up having little control over the terms of their independence, as they were not invited to the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The U.S. would decide Cuba's fate as an independent nation. They allowed Cuba's independence but placed several restrictions. Firstly, the U.S. was allowed to keep a military base at Guantanamo Bay and have military presence throughout the island. They were also allowed to control Cuba's foreign affairs, intervene in any of their Cuban affairs, and Cuba was not allowed to let any other nations have military presence on the island. The U.S. significantly benefited from this outcome, as they were able to let American businesses take advantage of Cuba's abundant natural resources and have a permanent military presence in the Caribbean. However, many Cubans were dissatisfied with the outcome. They felt that they were being taken advantage of and still had not gained full independence. The limitations gave way to bitter relations between the U.S. and Cuban population and would eventually allow the Castro dictatorship to take over. The story of Cuba's independence is a prime example of the U.S.'s exploitation of developing nations and its imperialistic actions that it took throughout the early 20th century. The Spanish-American War was mainly driven by American imperialism, as this was the time the United States was first becoming a world power. Since the American population was not in support of American imperialism, yellow journalism was able to give an excuse for starting a war with Spain. The result of the war only furthered America's power in the Western Hemisphere and secured itself as a superpower. The effects of this can be seen during World War I as the Allies recognized the US's military power could help them win the war, and the Central Powers were weary of the United States' entry.